Next up on our little chopping block is The Last Story. Now, I initially reserved this game because I was at GameStop one time, I found out I still had some store credit on my account, and he said, oh, you should reserve this game, it's going to be limited print. And I actually initially learned about this game when I did a story for the paper about Operation Rainfall. Now, for those of you who don't know, Operation Rainfall was this online internet petition to Nintendo to import 3 games to the US, 3 large-scale role-playing games that were made for the Wii, but didn't have any planned releases for the US. It's similar to Operation Moonfall and the Get Me Off the Moon movement, where they're petitioning the video game companies themselves in order to get stuff either made or distributed. And so this is one of the 3 games requested in Operation Rainfall. The first one from Operation Rainfall that got released was Xenoblade Chronicles. And what really interested me in this game was actually the people behind it. Because, again, I mean, I used to be a Final Fantasy nerd until I found out how flawed the later games were, and not just by watching reviews, but actually trying to play some of them. And so when I found out that this was being made by Mistwalker, I was actually kind of excited, because, I mean, a lot of the older Final Fantasy games are highly underrated. I mean, again, I know a lot of people who are like huge fans of 7, 8, and 10. 9 is my favorite Final Fantasy game, but in the case of Mistwalker, the only other game from Mistwalker that I've played was Lost Odyssey, which, again, Lost Odyssey I liked, but it also had its flaws, mainly in the sense that I kept finding myself falling asleep while playing. It was only when you got into the actual story that things got interesting. And so I had a few different ideas of what I might get into with The Last Story. So first thing I have to say is that I definitely like these designs more than what's seen in Lost Odyssey, because they're definitely a lot more approachable than, say, the more Asian-oriented designs of Lost Odyssey or the more cartoony designs of Blue Dragon. These kind of find a nice middle ground while still being unique. I got like one of the special edition copies, so I got an art book, so I was able to actually analyze this in full detail and kind of look at the overall design scheme. And again, it still has kind of its Final Fantasy inspired designs, but you can tell they definitely took a more Western European feel to it. Because again, with Lost Odyssey, a lot of the designs were inherently like Asian influenced. These ones definitely feels more like influenced by medieval fantasy and influenced by more Western mythology. And just the overall art style, it's definitely a little more approachable, because you can tell they're kind of trying to copy the Tetsuya Nomura type of art style. And so on that front, the art style is definitely a lot more approachable to me as a gamer. I mean, a lot of it has like really earthy tones to it, especially in the towns. It kind of has this earthy but also this very warm feeling to it, kind of nice and relaxing. And then when you're out in the field kind of battling, things take a nice kind of cold, more hostile looking feel to it. So yeah, that's enough about the visual aesthetic to it. Most of you are probably curious is, how does the game play? Well, best way to describe it is that essentially it's kind of a new form of action RPG. Best way I can describe it, say you took a game like Kingdom Hearts and combined it with Final Fantasy XII. That's essentially what you would get when it comes to the battle system in this game, because it's not quite ATB, but it's not quite hack and slash action role-playing game either. Most of the other RPGs that I've played, they're usually very traditional, straightforward. You're like got the characters in a line, your enemies on another line, you each take turns back and forth, or you have the realistic pseudo MMO thing where everything is in real time and you have to interact it in real time with like waiting for things to cast and kind of having that delay to it. Or like in Phantasy Star, where everything moves really quickly, but you can't pause. I'm sorry, but that's one of the biggest things I hate about games is when they can't pause. Thankfully, this game actually allows you to pause, but it kind of does it in the ridiculous sense where it's not the start button, you have to press the X button. I'm playing this with Classic Controller Pro, so although it's not like automatic where you press a button and you slash, although you can change the settings to allow that where it's manual mode and you just push A to slash, having it kind of automatic, it definitely allows you to think more about the strategy, because I mean, you can kind of charge in and kind of wail on the enemy until they're down, but Sometimes you can get some stronger attacks off when you hide behind something and then kind of sneak attack them, or you draw the enemies away using the gathering ability, which is one of the key abilities to the game so far. Best way to describe it, you have a spellcaster, their spell, they have a countdown thing, you have to make sure that it counts all the way down, because if they get hit, the focus is lost. And so, as the main character Zale, one of the things you can do is you have the ability called Gathering, which essentially has all the enemies targeting you. Now, if you were by yourself, that ability would be kind of useless, but when you have your full party, which you get pretty early on, and the party constantly rotates throughout the game, it's definitely a handy ability because you use Gathering to kind of buy time for your spellcasters in order to have them cast their spells, or in certain situations you have to have certain characters go do certain things while you distract the enemy, and so the Gathering ability is pretty useful. So the battle system, in my opinion, it's very unique, and it's definitely it's fun. Outside of battle, the game's fairly traditional. I mean, you have your typical NPCs, you go and talk to them, there's their typical fetch quests, and so outside of battle, things are pretty traditional, but there is one problem I have with how things are outside of battle, because thing is, when you're controlling your character, Zale, in the game, he's running like really super fast, but everybody else is just walking normally, and that's common in most RPGs where characters just kind of have their set walk cycles, but one problem is that they actually have them react when you bump into them. And so, say you have an NPC you're trying to reach, and you're constantly trying to talk to them, but you run too fast and you bump into them, you're not able to talk to them until they get back to the spot they were at in their cycle. And that can get really annoying, especially when you're trying to get something done in a certain amount of time. That's the only one thing I found annoying, but a lot of the other gameplay elements I've found are actually pretty fun. Like, one, the equipment you actually equip affects your character's physical appearance, which is something that's pretty much rare in most JRPGs, because they usually have like their set outfit and nothing changes it, whereas this one, not only can you change the physical appearance by what you actually equip, you're also able to change the color of the equipment based on what types of dyes and colors you have in-game. So with the story, I can't say too much about it since I haven't played far enough in the game, but what I can say about this is that these characters are pretty likable. I mean, compared to other RPGs and to things like Lost Odyssey or even the other Final Fantasy games, these characters, you get a nice feel for what kind of characters they are right off the bat. They each have their own like interesting quirks. Like you have Zale. Zale, his personality is not as defined since he's supposed to be kind of representative of the player. But then you've got Dagran, Dagran is kind of the serious hero, but he has kind of his softer side, but he's serious, but he's always looking out for his fellow mercenaries. And then you've got Seren, who's essentially a drunkard warrior. She's essentially what most barbarian classes are in other Western RPGs, except she's a woman and she uses two swords. So you've got the drunkard, and then there's always the sort of flirtatious, thief-like character, except he's technically a mage. Mirania, she's kind of more the mother, and it's kind of funny how these like attributes also relate to their class, because Dagran, typical warrior, Seren, kind of the more like attack priority warrior, Zale all around, because again, based up to how the player plays the character. Then you've got Mirania, I think that's how it's pronounced. I haven't played the game in a while because of classes, but she's essentially sort of the white mage who kind of looks after everyone. And so a lot of the character traits, although they're fairly stereotypical of most RPGs, I feel they kind of create a nice dynamic between the characters. So you definitely see some very interesting interactions between the two, at least as far as I have played. Overall, what I can say about the story, it has likable characters, and although the story is very stereotypical, you still kind of enjoy it anyway because you've got such likable characters to kind of follow through, kind of to take this journey with. So that's most I can say about the story. The voice acting in this game, it's pretty good, but there are some synchronization issues with how it syncs up with the full motion video and with the gameplay. You kind of got the Final Fantasy X mouth flap problems where the mouth flaps don't quite match what they're saying. Well, it's not that they don't quite, it's that they don't match at all. I mean, you see, like, you hear the characters say one thing, but the mouth flaps are making completely different vowels and consonants. Now, one aspect of the gameplay that I know a lot of people are curious about is kind of how the online modes hold up. Now, I don't really play a lot of online games, mostly because a lot of the quote-unquote popular online games are on the Xbox or the PS3. I don't own a PS3, my family owns an Xbox, but I'm not going to pay $50 to essentially have a man-child screaming in my ear when he loses in Call of Duty. Now, there are 2 online modes in this game. One is the deathmatch mode, which is pretty self-explanatory. And basically you have your character, you choose any of the characters from the game, as well as some enemies, and you basically duke it out, and the prize is that you get items in-game. Like, you get, like, items you can sell, you get certain dyes and stuff, and it's basically stuff you unlock that you can actually take with you into your single-player game. And the other mode is co-op. The prizes are the same, but instead of fighting each other, you're working together to beat a boss. Now, one weird thing with the online stuff, it's both good and bad, is that the character you choose is the character as he is in the game. Like, what level he's at in your file, what equipment he has on, what colors he's wearing. That's the character you take into the online mode. Now, in deathmatch mode, even if you're lower leveled, if you strategize and if you kind of gauge the strengths of each player and kind of play them against each other, even at a lower level, you can still have a pretty good time and still have a pretty good chance of winning. Co-op, however, the levels are definitely not in your favor in co-op, and you really need a full party if you're gonna attempt co-op, because each lounge allows up to 6 players. If you don't have up to 6 players, you're really at a disadvantage. So unless you're really, really high leveled, then you definitely need a full party, which is hard to get on Nintendo Wi-Fi connection because of how people A, shun it, and B, just internet connections and times, there's just a lot of factors. And so you're lucky if you can get a full six player party. Because even if you have 3 people, it's still a challenge trying to gang up and beat the boss, especially when you get given one of the higher level bosses. So yeah, I'm gonna rate this differently from how I rate films because there's a lot more involved. So I'm essentially gonna narrow the fields down to presentation and gameplay. Story is usually a category I would put here, but since I haven't beaten the whole game, I can't really make a fair judgment on the story as a whole. So with presentation, the artwork is both approachable but also very intricate. It really kind of has the nice fantasy feel to it. The music is, well, gorgeous, and although you don't focus on it as much because of how active the gameplay is, but the music is still really good overall because it's Uematsu. And the voice acting, although the voice casting is good, there are some sync issues with how it syncs up to the mouth flaps, but if you can look past that, for the most part, it's still pretty enjoyable, and definitely better than some voice casts I've heard in most video games in recent years. In the case of gameplay, the battle system is very engaging. There's a great degree of customization you're able to do, especially when it comes to the character's appearance. If you're one of those people that really wants them to look a certain way, you now kind of have that freedom. Although you're limited by what the armor actually looks like in-game and what it upgrades to look like, it's still a fairly enjoyable aspect. And the online modes of the game are also really fun to play as well, but expect to struggle a little bit trying to get a lot of players because it's just a case of patience and logging on at the right time. If you're logging on late in the day, you may not get as many people, and it's also just a case of if you're doing deathmatch, you'll probably have a lot more fun and it's a lot more popular. If you're doing co-op, I recommend doing co-op if you have a lot of friends who play the game, because you really need a full party if you really want to try to survive co-op, because the bosses, at least from my experience, the bosses are freaking hard. So presentation and gameplay, I was going to give them separate ratings, but overall I'm giving this game a 4 out of 5 because it's a very enjoyable game. It's not for everyone. It's only really for people who are more into role-playing games. So if you've got someone who's basically Shooty McGee in Call of Duty or obsessed with Team Fortress, they probably won't enjoy this game as much. But this is definitely one of the more approachable role-playing games as opposed to some other role-playing games that have been released. It's not like something you can play with your family per se, but if you've got someone who's wanting to get into RPGs, this is definitely a game you could probably give them because it has its action-oriented elements to it, but it's definitely something that allows them to think more like a role-playing gamer, where there's a lot more strategy involved. And there's also the customization aspect. So that's my thoughts on the last story based on how much I've played. So that's it for this week's episode of Romney's Reviews. Hopefully it's a little bit shorter than last week's, and so it won't be as big when it comes to trying to watch it. So yeah, next week that we've got on the chopping block is going to be a single review. I'm going back to my single reviews thing. The double thing was just by happenstance. So next week I'm going to be reviewing Lawless. See you then.